This presentation focuses on the assessment of a parent's capacity to change within the risk model. My name is Bruce Thornton. I'm a trainer and consultant and work with David Paul of Gwynedd Council in originally developing the risk model. It is sometimes referred to as the Gwynedd risk model and sometimes as the Bruce Thornton risk model. This presentation is part of training and development resources developed by Gwynedd Council's Effective Child Protection Project. That model has 4 components. One of these is focused on threshold, so this presentation fits within the threshold component of effective child protection. The risk model was developed in order to ensure that child protection practitioners were able to make good and consistent decisions in relation to significant harm. Reducing variation in practice, reducing consistency is key to driving up practice. This presentation looks at the question of a parent's capacity to change and how this can be assessed. It looks in particular at the use of the 3 change tools which have been incorporated into the risk model. These are 7 steps of contemplation, continuation of motivation, change progress checklist. We will also look at some of the problems with change, lapse and relapse and disguised compliance. We'll look at the decisional balance tool, which explores pros and cons of change and how all the tools can promote change talk. There is guidance to the change tools and the use of the decisional balance tool. Parental capacity to change is one of the main components of significance of harm in Risk 2. These tools were developed to support practitioners to assess a parent's capacity to change. The risk model was developed to assist practitioners to assess the risk of significant harm in child protection. As part of the risk process, there is a focus on how well the child's needs are being met and a judgment about the capacity of a parent to meet the child's needs. This determines where there is an indication of harm. One of the main factors that make harm significant relate to the parents and in particular their ability to change. In Risk 2, change is a feature in Section 1, which looks at the parent's capacity, Section 5.2, which looks at the likelihood of harm occurring in the future, and Section 7, which looks at whether the harm is significant or not. The change tools were developed to assist practitioners in determining capacity to change. The change model is a specialist assessment tool in the risk model. It is based on the stages of change model originally presented by Prochaska and Di Clemente in 1982. The model includes 6 stages of change: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and relapse. It was further developed by Toni Morrison for application in work with families and featured by Morrison and Howarth in The Child's World. It is a conceptual model that helps us understand change as a process. It suggests that change is progressive through the 5 of the 6 stages. These are pre-contemplation, meaning not ready; contemplation, getting ready; preparation, being ready; action and maintenance could be described as doing it and keeping going. The 6th stage is relapse. In the model, lapse and relapse are stages where a person leaves the process of change temporarily as a lapse or more permanently a relapse. This can happen at any stage from determination to action to maintenance. It is this image you'll see it shown as a side loop could be linked to determination, action or maintenance. The nature of change is that individuals learn from behaving differently. So lapse and relapse are not considered failures, but as reaction to new coping strategies, which may not have worked as well as hoped, and where there is therefore opportunity to learn lessons. These change tools were developed as part of the risk model and have been among the most popular of the specialist assessment tools. The change model is a single tool with 3 elements. It can also be split into 3 smaller tools. The 7 steps of contemplation is a checklist. It includes 7 statements which indicate whether a person is ready to start thinking about change or not. Unless a person is at contemplation stage where they are getting ready to change, it's unlikely that any change will be sustainable. So, it's important to know if a person is at contemplation, getting ready, or at pre-contemplation, not ready yet. The second tool is the continuum of motivation. It explores the type of statements made by an individual. It is acknowledged for change to be sustainable, the person has to own and believe in the need to change themselves. These are indicated in statements such as, I want to change, or I don't like things as they are. This is in contrast to someone stating they'll do anything they're told, or will do anything if it means their child would return to their care. There is little ownership or belief in statements such as these. The continuum motivation helps identify internal versus external focus to a parent's motivation to change. The third tool is the change progress checklist. This records where the person is at that time on the stages to change. It records the stage the individual has achieved on their change and provides a record of supporting evidence. We'll look at each of these in detail. The 7 steps of contemplation is a checklist. These 7 statements represent the conditions that indicate a person is at the contemplation stage. If these conditions are not met, the individual is probably still at the pre-contemplation stage, meaning they are not ready to consider change. It is important to confirm whether the person is ready for change or not. If they are still ambivalent, still not ready for change, the child protection practitioner should work on building a stronger foundation for change with the individual. Change talk can be promoted so that the individual can talk about consequences and what motivates them towards change. The decisional balance tool, also called change, weighing it up, can help to focus on these areas, exploring both positives and the drawbacks of change and of staying the same. We'll also introduce this in this presentation. To record the 7 steps, there is a checklist to confirm whether this criteria is met or not. If you answer no or are not sure, it provides an opportunity for the practitioner to explore this with the family. As with all tools, they provide focus and a structure for conversations. This conversation with families is more important than the form itself. The form provides a place to record evidence if needed and your conclusions. Using this tool, you should be clear whether someone is ready for change or not. The second tool is the continuum of motivation. In all walks of life, we talk about change. For example, in lifestyle, diet and exercise. There seems to be a constant battle and an industry helping people to find ways of motivating themselves or staying motivated. And when we look at people who are trying to change, it's common to ask whether individuals are doing this because they want to or because they are told to. There is an understanding that in order to secure long-term change, people have to be motivated themselves to do it because they want to, not because someone forces them to do. We can categorize these as 2 extremes. Internal motivation and external motivation. What makes this more problematic in child protection is that the very powers at our disposal to protect children also places families in a situation of greater threat and they fear losing their children. Families will often agree to anything to avoid that consequence. So, if people respond to this external pressure, how do we know if they are really motivated to change, that they are genuine and that change will be sustained? The continuum motivation is a checklist of statements. These range between the 2 extremes of phrases that indicate internal and external motivation. You can see the contrast in these statements. The statements of internal motivation suggest they are taking responsibility and that they are capable of taking action. In contrast, statements such as, "You're my problem," "It's your job to solve my problems," place the responsibility on others. It may be useful to think of internal motivation as being associated with free will, taking responsibility. In contrast, external motivation is a response to perceived threat of resentment, where parents are agreeing to doing things because others are telling them to do it. To record the continuum of motivation, the checkboxes identify any statements used by the parent. This provides a visual indication of the main concentration of motivation. Is it an internal or an external motivation bias? An internal motivational bias would be promising. An external motivational bias would indicate that further work's needed to develop a stronger foundation for change. The continuum motivation concludes with a decision which confirms whether the parent demonstrates a high degree of internal motivation to change. There are 3 further sections to record additional information. The conclusion about the parent's motivation, what further work needs to be done to develop or reinforce their motivation to change, and the overall conclusion. If you establish that motivation is mainly external and that further work is required, change talk can be promoted so the individual can talk about consequences and what motivates them towards change. As with all tools, they provide focus and a structure for conversations. This conversation with families is more important than the form itself. The third tool is the Change Progress Checklist. The stages of change is a conceptual model that helps us understand and work with families to change. A 6-stage model starting with pre-contemplation stage. This is the not ready stage. It is always shown as part of the cycle in the stage of change diagrams, but could be thought of as being outside the cycle of change. Contemplation is about getting ready. Preparation is ready for change. Action is doing it. And maintenance is keeping going. The ideas about lapse and relapse are when parents exit the cycle of change temporarily or sometimes for an extended period. Relapse is when new learned strategies to cope with those challenges that had previously beaten people fail under stress. At that time, the strategies fail or are inadequate. Above all, it tells us that change isn't easy and that there will be setbacks. They allow a person to learn, develop other strategies, and recognise how resilient they need to be in the future to cope with the challenges that will inevitably come. The Change Progress Checklist keeps track of this journey. The Change Progress Checklist records at which stage the parent is at the moment of assessment. The section starts with a tick box selection against each stage. It provides a section to record the evidence supporting this conclusion. It records action to be taken over a period and identifies future milestones to aim for. It includes a section on difficulties, focusing on lapses and relapses, what lessons were learned as a consequence of these difficulties encountered during the change progress. We'll look at each stage of the change model in turn. The first stage is pre-contemplation. It is a stage of not being ready for change. It is defensive, in denial, projects blame on others, is depressed and is unaware of problems. The majority of families who come to the attention of children's services are said to be at pre-contemplation stage. They may even be unaware of or only have a vague recognition of any concerns. They can come over as hostile or aggressive, and this can make engagement difficult for the worker. The family have not yet considered that their behaviour needs to change. They may not have made the commitment to the change being discussed, as they have not come to terms themselves with their need to change. Without this commitment, you may find tokenism, superficial agreement, or unrealistic commitments such as "we'll do anything you say." The second stage is contemplation. It is a stage of getting ready for change. It's important to ensure you've reached this step. The 7 steps of contemplation can be used to help you confirm they're at the contemplation stage rather than the pre-contemplation stage. If a parent is at pre-contemplation, many of the interventions will have little effect. They won't be maintained, or there will be tokenism or disguised compliance. It is also important to differentiate between external and internal motivation to change. The nature of child protection often creates an external motivation for the parent to change. Until the parent has a strong internal motivation to change, the effectiveness of intervention may be limited. The continuation of motivation checklist can be used to establish what type of motivation the parent is demonstrating. The decisional balance tool, also called change weighing it up, can also help you have a conversation about weighing up the pros and cons with the parent, the positives and the drawbacks of changing, and of staying as they are. All of these approaches, 7 steps, continuation and motivation, and the decisional balance tool, amplify the conversation about change with the parent. The third stage is determination. This is a transitional stage. Parents make informed choices. They accept there are problems and how this is affecting their children. It is at this stage when the balances of the rewards of change and the consequences of failure are understood. Often this conversation happens when assessments are undertaken. It is important to provide services and interventions in support of this change, even though the assessment is not yet complete. Don't wait for the assessment to finish before thinking about services that may help. There are several processes where plans are discussed and reviewed. These include conferences, core groups, planning meetings and reviews. These require formal agreements about the actual actions that the person will be undertaking. In addition to thinking about the benefits of change as part of action planning, it is also important to consider the consequences of change for the person. This can include fundamental change to the social networks and long-term habits of parents, and these may be resistant to change. As part of planning, contingencies in case things don't go to plan can be considered. Being realistic and open about these difficulties should lead to a better prospect that change will be successful. In effective child protection, the steps to change approach will be an example of a very visual and transparent agreement about what will change and how this will be achieved. The fourth stage is action. The action stage is the stage of doing. It is about putting new behaviour into action, new thinking, new behaviour, and often new relationships. The parent will have decided to change and is attempting new behaviours. This may include interventions of services provided to support this change. It is important that the parent is prepared and understands what the interventions of services are and what these are trying to achieve. If a parent's progress isn't successful, if they stop or lapse, it may be initially labelled as failure. However, there may be a variety of reasons for these. A confusion about what the service is trying to achieve, or an indication they are still at contemplation stage and not yet quite ready for change. The fifth stage is maintenance. This stage is about keeping going, the process of sustaining change, internalising what is new and consolidating change behaviour. This stage can be overlooked. In services where there is pressure of workload and turnover of cases, once change has been achieved, it is easy for the practitioner's focus to wane, for the practitioner to think that once there is action, the change has been effected and will be embedded. However, without adequate attention to making sure the change is sustained, there is a real risk of lapse or relapse. During the action stage, new behaviours are tried, and during the maintenance stage, this becomes more permanent. However, with changes to behaviour, pattern and relationships, it is over time that various challenges really test these new coping strategies. It is important that the practitioner maintains the change relationship with the parent to support them as they learn from the challenges they face, and they put the change strategies into action. This ongoing support helps to celebrate achievements and to refine the coping strategies and the contingency plans over time. The relationship also provides an early warning of signs of lapse or relapse. The sixth stage in the stages of change is relapse. However, in the change model, there are a number of difficulties of change that we will explore. These are lapse, relapse, and disguised compliance. The change model differentiates between lapse and relapse. A lapse is a slip, a relapse is a fall. It is acknowledged that change will be difficult and behaviour may revert to previous patterns several times before change can be maintained. A lapse is not necessarily seen as negative or a failure. It can be identified at an early stage and coping strategies or contingencies put in place. A lapse is seen as a temporary state. It may be a single event or a short series of events. There is inevitably potential for learning from these incidents. They will inform the strategies people use and fine-tune ways of helping people manage these behaviours better in the future. A lapse can therefore reinforce the change, provide prompts for building more resilient coping strategies. A lapse should be formally identified and treated as part of moving towards maintenance of change. A lapse is a rich source of information about how the parent is adapting to new ways and uncovering those challenges that are most problematic for them. In contrast, a relapse is a fall. A relapse is reverting to the past behaviours. Any coping strategies that were available were overwhelmed. There is more of a sense of permanency about a relapse in comparison with a lapse. By definition, the fact that agencies involved suggests that the child's needs were not being previously met or the child was subjected to harm. A relapse into previous behaviour will therefore be a concern about the safety of the child. It may be necessary to put measures in place to protect the child or provide additional services to the family during a relapse. Despite the negative impacts of risks associated with relapse, there will be opportunities for learning and developing new strategies for change, but only if change still remains a viable option. Relapse, in contrast with lapse, is seen as a more permanent state. It is a behaviour where recovery will be more difficult, where past patterns of behaviour have returned and coping strategies have been overwhelmed. Such recovery is likely to require greater input and external support than in a lapse. This is a brief overview. There is a full presentation to disguised compliance available as part of these resources. The focus of this presentation is assessing capacity to change. One of the difficulties with change is the relatively new concept of disguised compliance. If the focus is on change and we are assessing capacity to change and monitoring parents' progress, the prospect that a parent is intentionally deceiving the practitioner that they are changing is a concern. Consider this quote. Disguised compliance involves a parent or carer giving the appearance of cooperating with the child welfare agencies to avoid raising suspicions, to allay professional concerns and ultimately to diffuse professional interventions. The quote shows intent to deceive on behalf of parents. Its purpose is to avoid attention, avoid suspicion and concerns. Think of disguised compliance as something done on purpose. Disguised compliance is a relatively new concept in child welfare literature and research, and the evidence base is not yet very well developed. The headline, the title, would be Appearing to Cooperate, but Nothing Changes for the Child. This is a list of some of the possible indicators. Effective child protection is about achieving change, so the lack of real change should be questioned. What is the reason for this? It is important to understand the child's experience of life at home. If the parents report circumstances which are not reflected in what the child is telling you, ask why. You'll see the request for pre-arranged visits. Is this because it allows the parent to stage or prepare the setting, control the evidence available to the practitioner? Be questioning. You'll see the reference to complaints. Hostile, complaining parents who make it difficult for the worker to engage may be an indicator. Think why. As with all these indicators, they could also have other explanations. How do we guard ourselves as practitioners? What are the checks or countermeasures to disguise compliance? A number of the suggestions are about questioning. Lord Laming used the words social workers, police officers, health visitors have to recognise this in their evidence gathering, have to be sceptical, have to be streetwise, have to be courageous. I would also draw your attention to the comment about being over-optimistic. This can be challenging when we focus so much on strengths-based practice. The last three measures are about keeping focus on the child's world. Don't get trapped as a practitioner to the parents' problems and the need for these to be solved. It's very easy to get drawn in. These are secondary to changing the day-to-day life of the child. The effective child protection model focuses on change and has a system to measure progress. It is very much a countermeasure to disguised compliance. We have been looking at difficulties with change and looked at lapse, relapse and disguised compliance. A decision within a child's time frame is not necessarily difficult, but an overall parameter that one needs to remember when assessing capacity to change. When making decisions, ask yourself, is this within the child's time frame? What we mean is, Can the child wait for this to be better? Harm may continue to happen to a child during the period of change. Can we afford to wait? Is the harm worth tolerating while change takes place? Are we willing for the child to remain suffering harm and being at risk of significant harm whilst we wait and hope that the change happens? We are effectively balancing things. It will be better if things change and improve as predicted. We can tolerate the harm. To remove the children would cause greater harm. These are difficult balances to consider. Research tells us that babies adopted early in life are best placed to develop secure attachment. So, you should strive for permanence as soon as possible because the prospects of recovery are higher. There is a general view that with very young children you shouldn't delay or wait too long. Their long-term prospect of recovery in a new family unit is better, whereas moving a 14-year-old is less likely to yield the same recovery. So always remember, when assessing capacity to change, ask, can this be done within the child's time frame? The decisional balance tool is a specialist assessment tool. The decisional balance sheet or tool is known as change, weighing it up in effective child protection. It's a commonly used framework in motivational interview and collaborative communication. It is you, the parents, to explore reasons why they want to change and to show some of the reasons why they find it hard. Some of the key principles in motivational interviewing is that people become more motivated to change if they practice talking about change. The decisional balance tool is a framework to develop this change talk with parents, and we know that the more change talk a parent does, the more likely it is they believe they can change. So, this is a framework for conversations, a platform for change talk with parents. The tool is a simple 2x2 matrix. It explores, in sequence, staying the same, what's good about staying the same. Staying the same, what's not so good about staying the same. Changing, what's not so good about changing. Changing, what's good about changing. The tool may help parents make a decision to commit to change. The tool will also help you to understand the motivation of the parent, why they'd want to change, and the barriers to change. The decisional balance sheet stimulates change talk. The tool provides a focus for collaborative conversations. It's important to remember that talking about change with a parent is a way of building their commitment. Think of your conversations with them as an important intervention. Listen out for how they talk about change. A few points to remember. Try to avoid using your words. The focus of the tool is on getting to a point of understanding what the person is feeling in their own words. Try to avoid the temptation to find a solution for them. You may have a strong sense of what you feel they need to do, but the focus here should be on actively listening to what the person is saying or feeling. Opening up such discussions can be empowering, but they can also highlight a person's fears. Your role of supporting the person through exploring their feelings is a key element of the tool. The baseline assessment of the likelihood to change has been brought together by Dr. Arnon Bentavim and colleagues. It is based on an academic review of relevant studies. What do we know about the prognosis for change? What factors indicate a poor prognosis and what indicates a hopeful prognosis? Dr. Bentavim and colleagues identified 7 areas which seem to determine prognosis for successful change. These were the level of abuse, how much responsibility the parent took, strengths that were present, the child's time frame, resources available to support change, relationship and the parent's attitude towards professionals. The key factors tend to polarize on a continuum. For example, higher levels of abuse are linked to poor prognosis, whereas moderate abuse and harm has more hopeful prognosis. Prognosis is better if we see parents take responsibility. This would, of course, correlate to internal motivation to change, a concept that is explored with the continuum of motivation tool. In contrast, prognosis is poor if parents don't take responsibility for their actions and circumstances. What are their attitudes towards professionals? Very negative attitudes indicate a poor prognosis. Do they have strengths, or at least a balance between strengths and difficulties? A balance of strengths and difficulties indicates a more hopeful prognosis. Are there resources available to support them or not? Resources increase likelihood. And is the change possible within the child's time frame? Of course, change has to have some time boundaries. If it takes too long, the child continues to suffer significant harm. It may be too late for the child to have a realistic prospect of recovery in life. A checklist identifies some of the key issues that are linked to the likelihood of change. This presentation is about parental capacity to change and some of the key practice issues in its assessment. We introduced a conceptual model that may help you make sense of things. The stage of change model or change model. There are 3 tools in the change model. The 7 steps of contemplation clarifies whether the parent is still at pre-contemplation. If at pre-contemplation, the parent is not yet ready to change and more foundation work is indicated. The continuum of motivation explores whether there is internal motivation to change. If not, change is unlikely to be sustainable. The Stages of Change checklist tracks progress across the stages of change, recording the lessons learned as change is implemented. We explored some difficulties that can be encountered in change. Lapse, a slip on the way. Relapse, a fall. We talked about how these can inform your ongoing work with parents to develop more resilient coping strategies. We introduced disguised compliance and some of the indicators to be aware of. In the decisional balance tool, or the weighing it up tool, we looked at how the tool is only a framework for having better conversations with parents about change, and that talking about change builds commitment. We reminded practitioners that change has to be achieved within the child's time frame. We have also continuously highlighted that any assessment of capacity has to think about the child's life and the child's description of life day to day. It was important not to get distracted by parental problems and needs. And to finish, we looked at the key likelihood determinants identified in studies. Indicators of good likelihood of change were less serious abuse linked to parents who take responsibility for their circumstances, where there is a balance of strengths to the difficulties. Their attitude towards professionals must be positive enough for a working relationship to be possible, and the availability of resources to support the parents also helped. As you reflect on your practice, ask yourself which of these ideas do you think are most useful to you? Is the Stages of Change model useful for you? Do you think you'd be able to identify which stage a particular parent was at? Think about the difficulties you imagine in using any of these, and every time you do use it, how would you reflect at the time? How would you know how well you used it? And of course, the key issue is the question of significance of harm. There is a clear link between significance and parental capacity to change. Do you understand how this fits into risk too? As you develop your practice, remember that to learn, you do, and then you actively reflect on what you have done. This can be done through self-reflection, reflection with colleagues, and most importantly, in your supervision sessions.